All right. Let's have a quick conversation about analyzing a particular kind of paper. This paper is the Escalation, Inversion, and Other Oddities of Situational Cyber Stability. It is by Jason Healy and Robert Jervis. If I manage to click properly in the window. So this is who they are. Honestly, I don't like bringing up who particular authors are on a review because it should be as little relevance as possible. But if you weren't aware who these people are, here's a list of who they are. Okay, so if you've been watching my videos on analyzing cyber policy papers, you've seen that I actually developed a quick taxonomy of cyber policy papers. And in general, there's 4 of them. And one of the major types is presenting a model. And they sort of all look very similar to this, right? So here you're going to have, there's 4 of them. 4 is a good number. By good, I mean that's what most people do. In terms of presenting this little model. And I like that they have a table of it and present it very clearly. And this is the one. So they have, here's the mechanism: pressure releasing, sparking a conflict, pulling out the big guns, escalation, inversion, which is where the title of the paper is. That's what the title is. Okay, so I don't want to focus too much on the table right now as opposed to going through some of the arguments that are supporting this model. But you should, when you first start analyzing one of these papers, I always start by reading their table and trying to figure out a few things. We're going to talk about those things, right? So what are the questions to ask when people build one of these models in a cyber policy paper? What is it they're really doing? Right? Or if you're building a cyber policy paper, you're literally typing away while you listen to me talk. What is it that you're doing? So there's a number of events in the world. You've put them in some sort of framework, and you're trying to classify them, right? So you're trying to teach me, the viewer, the reader, how you would classify a particular event in the world, or in some cases sequence events, but usually just one event. And so you're grouping them, you're coloring them. At the top, red things, cyber conflicts that are sparking something. In the middle here, maybe these blue ones are escalation, inversion. At the bottom, you have major, bring out the big guns or something. I don't know. You're dividing and classifying. And then here's another example. We have groupings. We have sort of like, a bell curve perhaps of standard distance from a certain area. So this is the sort of thing that you are doing implicitly when you build one of these models. You're saying, here are the groupings that these events fall into. And it's important because once we've grouped them, we can start arranging structured and analytic techniques around that. That's what you're trying to do, ideally in a scientific way. And what does it mean to do that in a scientific way? What does that even mean? Why does Dave, some random guy on the internet, keep getting so frustrated at people's inability to bring real science into policy papers? Let's talk about it. When you're grouping something, we're talking about how tightly grouped are these events? Are they spread across the field like these green ones, or are they tightly in a little ball like those red ones? That's me asking, how distinct are these? What is the shape of the different clusters? Right? So at the bottom here, you have, a blue cloud that actually intersects with your red cloud. Are some of these things going to be in multiple categories? Are they going to sort of be ambiguous? Are we gerrymandering our taxonomy? You'll often see this. People will have a grouping where it's sort of like shaped like a kidney bean, and then another grouping in the little hook of the kidney bean, right? So they've correlated all of one sort of thing that they like, and then in the middle they'll have like, oh, then there's this other thing, right? So are they gerrymandering their taxonomy so that they feel better about themselves, or it supports their argument better? This is extremely common. Why did we choose a certain number of clusters? Why do we have 4 categories of different cyber escalatory issues instead of 5 or 3 or 1? Like, why 4? Is it just because that looks good on the table? Is that the level of support of an analytics that we have? So these are questions you're asking yourself. Are you looking at the data on the right dimensional axis, right? So a lot of data could be very mushy on one axis using one factor. Let's say number of ODE used, right? So maybe all the attacks that use 4 ODE group up together, and then all the attacks that use 0 ODE group up in a huge grouping, right? So that would say attacks that use X ODE might be a good or bad, probably very bad, axis for your analysis, right? So it's real common to find that they did stuff with a very particular axis. Why are there a million things that fall into one category and none that fall into another category? That's another issue that you're going to have. So sample set unwieldiness. Why is there a billion samples in one area? And again, are the boundaries between types clean? Or are they all mushy together? Like here, like why is this stuff not green, this other stuff here, right? Like why? I don't understand that. I don't know the answer to that question. And again, when people do these things, and this is a cyber policy issue from miles back, they shove simple prisoner's dilemma basics where it really does not belong. And I'm just going to give you a quick example from every paper. So one of the funny things about like game theory is that tit for tat is a very particular strategy for playing very particularly arranged games. So if your entire mind is focused on like very simple prisoner's dilemma style games, you're unlikely to be making progress in any kind of cyber policy. That's just the way it is, right? So in nuclear policy, some of these things make a lot more sense because it's either we blew up the world or we didn't blow up the world, right? So prisoner's dilemma comes into it very clearly. But no one has really found a good way to look at cyber with prisoner's dilemma basics. And what I think triggers me is that tit for tat is one of many, many strategy families that you find when talking about this stuff. And you can go and watch many lectures on this stuff where you can examine different strategies and their effects using different tiny variations on prisoner dilemma games, right? So super fun if that's what you're into, but that, every time someone says it here, it just makes me think that they haven't watched those videos. They should probably go watch those videos, right? So it's just a weird thing. That's just triggering me personally, not other people, right? So I don't know. So Nash equilibriums, I want people to understand that, where this math is going is not where it should be going, right? So you're going to start seeing this stuff. So this will start triggering you as you start reading more of these model papers. So let's talk about issues with this particular paper's just overall model that you might have. These are my issues, but you, as you're reading it, might have your own thoughts. And I like to divide these thoughts into what I call bug classes, right? So in C programming, you'll have bug classes like format string, stack overflow, these, who knows? Others, lots of them, use after free, who knows? Other stuff. In policy papers, you have this sort of one, like a discreteness flaw. So people will untangle stuff that cannot be untangled, where correlations are implicit in the analytics, right? So in this case, we're untangling the cyber domain essentially from a lot of different things. So let's just say events are correlated together, right? So if I'm already in conflict with somebody, I'm likely to be doing a lot of events, and those events are not necessarily singular. Like, what is the unit? Is it a single, like what you would call attack? Like, I blew up a power system with cyber. Is it a campaign? So I'm blowing stuff up and I'm reading their emails and publishing them online, and I'm being just a mess to them all online, right? I'm sending stuff. Is it something larger? Is it something smaller? So what is the unit of measurement, and is that unit of measurement right? And I just don't know if we got there in this paper, right? So the rationale, especially when you're talking tit for tat, you're thinking they did something to me, I did something back. But if we're talking long-term campaigns that I've planned out over years and that are leveraging all sorts of different things, failing and succeeding, the rationale that there's different events in this domain is pretty sus. Let's just put it that way. And I think the abstraction flaws are pretty rife in a lot of these papers. Like, why are we claiming the escalation is just in the cyber domain and is not a unique dynamic between two geopolitical entities and all of their conflicts, right? So I just found a lot of this was sort of, we're trying to separate out and contain this thing to make an argument about escalation in the cyber domain that maybe is not there to be made, right? Like, we don't know that these concepts apply, which is a little bit what this paper starts asking. It's like, do these concepts even apply? And I think it presumes that they do so that it can make its conclusions. So this was just very weird. They redefine horizontal escalation to mean something very particular, which is not geographic spread. Geographic spread is something in cyberspace too, right? Like, it doesn't necessarily, I don't know. So this whole paragraph, honestly, this was wrong. Is kind of where I'd go. Like, this is not the way you would want to think about it. If I want to think about intensification, I don't know if this is where you would go. So sometimes they're making sort of definitional choices by defining things on an axis. So maybe there's 100 different ways to say what horizontal escalation is in cyberspace. And I don't know that they're choosing the right one or the right combinations. And I would say they're not. Let's just put it that way. I don't think they are. And I think if you read the paper, you're not going to think they are either, right? Like, what does it mean to increase the number of troops committed to a fight in cyberspace? Probably we could all come up with something silly to say about that. All right, so let's talk about all the other issues I had with this paper, which, if you read the paper, and I hope you do, I hope what you do is you read the paper, then watch my video, then maybe read the paper again, because that is one of the best ways to sort of learn how to do this kind of analysis, right? So, and we're going to talk about in the conclusions why I do this analysis. So, one thing I've noticed is the United States in particular, but also Europeans and probably others, is having a lot of hard time understanding persistent engagement as it comes out. And you have a lot of different voices coming out from the United States, which confuses everybody else too, right? And the question that I would love to ask everybody who is writing papers on this sort of thing is persistent engagement a way to describe what is happening on the internet, or is it a defined strategy that we are using on the internet? Like, can we stop persistently engaging if we want? If we want to, and we decide to do that, do our adversaries get a vote? These are all questions you're going to have to ask yourself. Because here's how I see it. Persistent engagement describes what's happening on the internet. It is not necessarily what we are doing. We are engaging with our adversaries, but we have no choice other than to do that. That's just how it works. So in that scenario, whenever the paper is making arguments that persistent engagement is escalatory, it is, I think, conflating what the model people are using to describe what's happening with how we're trying to act. So there may be particular parts of persistent engagement that are escalatory in different ways. And I would make an argument for those things because I think sometimes escalation is warranted, right? Like, I think when we find a Chinese company stealing American IP, leveraging that to get into other markets or the Chinese market, frankly, then we should delete their Active Directory controller. That's a personal belief that I have. I think that would change things, right? So that is escalatory engagement for sure, right? Like that's essentially what the North Koreans did to Sony Pictures Entertainment. So, and by the way, it always annoys me when people confuse Sony with Sony Pictures Entertainment, just which I think this paper did do. So don't do that. Anyway, so those are things that like I think by saying persistent engagement itself is escalatory, etc. I don't think that's right. I just don't think that's how you should talk about this stuff. I could be wrong. Everyone can disagree. Yeah, and one issue with a lot of papers is that they build their argument off very low confidence conclusions from other papers, or they treat every conclusion from every paper as if it has confidence 100, right? So if it agrees with their argument, they include it. It's like, this is not the right way to do things realistically. And let me just be completely honest in that you should never, ever, ever, ever use a survey for anything in science. Surveys are not good. And don't cite surveys. If someone does a survey, just don't ever do that. All right? So that's one of the examples. And I did not, honestly, I've seen a lot of great critiques of this other paper too. And so I would just say, like, if you are citing it in your paper, you are implicitly saying that you think it's 100% or very good, like B grade or above confidence. And that worries me because you should never cite some of these things. And some of these things have serious issues. Again, with the tit for tat. Oh my God. Look, it just doesn't mean that, right? Like, it's just, I don't know. Anyway. So one of the issues with this paper that I noticed is it talks a lot about military efforts in history, but then also, as you know, indicates that people see it as an intelligence contest, which seems like something that you would note if you were doing peer review on the paper, right? So I don't know what peer review this paper went through. It was in like the Texas Journal for Psychology and Cyber or something. I honestly don't think most papers go through a real peer review, which is why I do these reviews, because I think we can all benefit from a better peer review environment where people actually look at papers with some thought. This one, if you're looking at things from an intelligence contest standpoint, but you're mostly focused on military stuff, the United States is pretty clear about the difference between CNE and CNA. A lot of that stuff, I think, is just a useful mental framework, if for no other reason than one of the largest players on the field uses those rules and uses that terminology and mindset. And this, I think, this particular paragraph also hinted at where the paper could get better too. So I'm going to come back to that. Okay, so there's a bunch of metrics, right? So if you're talking about escalation, you're going to try to say we're going to put metrics on escalation of some kind, at least the unit value. Like we're going to say more and more people are being put on the job of cyber command, for example. How many of those people came out of the National Security Agency, though, right? Like, are they in the parlance of this paper? That might have just been moving, units from one ship to another ship, right? Like, you didn't increase units necessarily, right? Just because you have a different unit doesn't mean that the manpower has changed. And I don't know that there's a data set you could go to where you're saying like, oh, the manpower has changed. The latent cyber power. Look, here's the honest truth is we don't have the data necessary to truly judge if the increase in people looking at cyber is abnormal. Is it increasing over time? Is the delta of the delta increasing? We don't have that data. The honest thing this paper should have said is, we think maybe there has been escalation in terms of intensification of resource allocation to this effort. But it's hard to say. And they mention that these trends might just reflect increased digital dependence, right? So if you're looking pretty far back, I think they look back, pretty far, if you're looking before Facebook, then yeah, obviously your information operations team is now all over Facebook. That's the thing. So this is just, it's a weak argument. It's weak to start talking about like there has been an increase in all these different states without, looking at the problem. Is the problem set increasing larger than the allocation? Like the delta is in relation to something. And we don't have that here, right? So because there's no way to measure increased digital dependence or technological advancement. The reality is our investment might have been a net decrease based on the scope of the problem increasing. So even if I'm dumping 2 vials of food coloring into my bathtub, if I'm also filling the bathtub up a lot faster than I'm increasing the amount of food coloring I'm adding, the the bathtub actually gets less blue over time. Does that make sense? So you have to figure out what the context here is. Are there natural thresholds to cyber escalation? Is a question that you're going to ask yourself when they say that there are fewer thresholds being passed now. They're saying the magnitude has marched in relentless increase, but they're not saying that that increase is due to escalation. That's the missing link. The increase could simply be due to more value, right? Like when we start to explore mining asteroids, the value of the asteroids is what determines the increase of resources. So it's just, I don't know. It made me ask. And then, so here's a paper that I guess we could read next. Escalation, I haven't read it yet, in 21st century operations in the information environment. So that would sort of tie into this paragraph, and we should definitely do that. Okay, so it just infuriated me, and it should infuriate you. You're like, if you don't believe it, which you should not because the argument is weak, that cyber conflict is definitely intensifying, and everybody may spark conflict. That cyber conflict is possibly intensifying or might do so in the future. All right, look, this is the most least content-filled sentence of all time. Cyber conflict is possibly intensifying or might do so in the future. Yeah, anything can happen in the future. Anything is possibly happening now. The world is an endless series of quantum flux. It's just, this sentence is like, our argument is weak, therefore please agree with us so we can move on with our lives and write the rest of the paper. It is a really bad sign. It should be a red flag if you're reviewing a paper that they make such weak claims. And we're going to get to that in the conclusion. All right, so what does it mean to resemble the past? Right? So this is something that comes up here. They say, these only hold true only if the next few decades generally resemble the past. What on earth does that mean? They go into a little bit of this. Look, at this point in the paper, you're probably like, we need to have stronger arguments, right? Like, these are not good arguments. Is balkanization, for example, a stabilizing factor? Would be something I would ask from reading this paper, and you should ask when reading this paper, because balkanization seems to be a very stabilizing factor. Is ransomware escalatory? Another question you're asking yourself. If not, why not? It appears to be, right? Like, it appears to be escalatory. So the escalation and inversion stuff I thought was really interesting, right? Like the idea that we're going to see, huge use of cyber once you get into a military crisis. So when someone attacks you, they're going to just lay it all on the table. And there's a really clear flaw in the argument here, which is that it is very, very rare for cyber to be used against cyber forces and disable them, right? Like, it's in theory possible, but it's like, this is like counter snipers or something, right? Like typically you're using cyber forces as attacking sort of counter value, right? Like you're sort of attacking businesses or gathering intelligence and disabling, an air control system or something like that, right? That's an attack on value. For me to hit your cyber team is very difficult. It's much more like me sending out subs to hit your ballistic missile subs, right? They're hiding, they're distributed across the globe. They're unlikely to be taken out by a first strike capability. And so this part of the argument I thought was, first of all, I thought it was pretty off base. It's only true if cyber versus cyber is innately very easy, right? Like the same way I can bomb a bunch of bombers who are just sitting around, in theory, if they're not, undercover, or hidden, or unknown where their location is, or other things. So this, it's not, that doesn't mean that it's wrong. The conclusion to the argument is wrong. It does mean the argument itself is wrong. The conclusions can still be all correct. That's one of the difficult things about analyzing these papers is often like you can agree with the conclusion and the paper itself can just be a bunch of who knows what, right? Logical flaws. And this is sort of where you're going to go with this. You're like, was, NotPetya a misfire of a counter? I mean, it was counter value, but like, does it fit this argument, right? So I think these are sort of examples and theories that you would want to put into this kind of argument of like, things are going to get super sketchy on the internet when we go into conflict with Russia. I thought this analysis was just very strange, right? Like, I don't know. Everything about it was weird, right? Like, yeah, it's difficult to distinguish offense from defense, but are we talking just about all offense, or are we talking about military style attacks or things that would be seen as escalatory? And like, I think it's a little conflicting that like we use all of our capabilities, but it's also like by definition, that means it's not escalatory. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know. So there's a lot here. It's just a bizarre analysis. Like, okay. So here's another common thing you're going to find is that many issues in papers, just in general, are going to be far too abstract to have meaning, right? So, like, if you can replace some of the words instead of cyber with like naval or, I don't know, space, or just pick anything, then that kind of means that you're not getting concrete and analytical discussion out of the paper, right? So this is one of those paragraphs, and you can read it as much as you want. I don't know that it's true, right? Like 5 different meanings of surprise, rely on deception and trickery. I don't know. I've never relied on deception and trickery in my life, but like that's just so weird. It's just a weird thing to do, right? Like they don't rely on deception and trickery. Some of them have some covertness, like I had a covertness bar on the first product that we sold, and it went to 11, and I just thought it was really funny. It did a lot of stuff, actually. It was really cool. And covertness and reliability are, in fact, opposites when you come to cyber. So in many cases, they, in fact, do not rely on deception and trickery, but actually require that you don't have any in order to be reliable and daring. So anyway, some of this stuff, that was... I sometimes it feels like I'm a little harsh on these papers, but we can do better, right? So I want to talk about how we can do better, right? Like one of the things I get out of papers like this, and there was another paper I read recently that was not great. One of the issues, one of the really cool things you get out of these kinds of papers is how difficult, how many knots do you have to tie yourself into to make something this abstract coherent? Like, how do I make these arguments useful is a very interesting concept. If all the papers talking about escalatory theory in cyber are just tearing themselves into little knots and just misusing abstractions and just being all over the place, what it actually is telling you is that problem set is not easily addressable in cyber, right? Like it is not an easily addressable theoretical framework to start talking about escalation ladders with cyber, right? So that doesn't mean they're not there. It means that it can be very, you probably will not see we don't have the coherent theory on it yet. And I guess you've probably noticed that I don't think this particular model is the coherent theory. Oh, wait, I failed. I failed at putting these in the thing. Okay. I think this was a really good point, which is that the Americans and people who are in the policy framework for America, which includes a lot of Europeans, have a lot of trouble with this. This is we have a lot of trouble understanding how our actions are viewed by others. I've 1,000 times seen Europeans point out that they view privacy as a first order class of security. So whereas we have like confidentiality, integrity, availability, I think the Europeans would put privacy in there, right? Like it's that important. And for those of you who are saying that confidentiality is privacy, you are wrong. It is different and distinct. But I think there's like a level of this is it's just a true thing. It's like adversaries and allies find a lot of this stuff different from how we say it. So, and that may just be like you guys need to sharpen up your sales pitch, right? Like that could be what's happening here. All right, so how I would fix this paper. 1, focus. It needs to focus. Focus on a really particular dynamic. Just China versus the US, just Israel versus Iran, just some, 2 countries, Egypt versus Jordan. I don't know, right? Like focus on a very particular dynamic where we have some good data, but it's not like overwhelmingly complex, which is the problem we have when trying to build a domain-specific model and rule set. Like that's just too big. And try to build in some specific geopolitical context. Like it may not just be cyber in the axes, right? Like these things, I think that's it. And I guess my final thing for all papers that build models is you have to make testable predictions. We can't jump to our proposals without being able to have a testable prediction, ideally in the short term, so you can say that your model does in fact have some validity. And that's something that I just think it's in your benefit as a researcher, as an academic, as a thought person. There's a bunch of different names for that. Scholar. I hate it when they say scholar. I'm a scholar. It's so silly. But it's in your benefit to make models that can't be tested, right? Like this is like being a string theorist. No way to know if you're right. The math is cool, but we got to get beyond that to move forward. We have to start making testable predictions to find out which models work the best, even before we start making recommendations based on those predictions, based on being able to manipulate that models, saying, oh, we should actually invest more in defense because this is the exact dynamic we can see and we can predict that. So I'm not going to say whether or not I agree or disagree with any of the proposals in the paper. I think some of them are very good. I just don't think the paper gets to those proposals via a model that you can back up. And that is the most important thing we can get out of these model analyses is make your model something you can really back up. And that's all I have for you today. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Hopefully you can kind of see where we're coming from and how to analyze these kind of papers. Again, this is the model we're talking about. And I highly encourage you to read the paper. And if you come up with completely different conclusions than I do, then leave a comment in the YouTube video. And don't forget to subscribe and click like, because this is how I make my living now, making videos about cyber policy papers. Thank you.